Okay. So much for the advantages. I haven't actually kept track of time, but there's only basically one more point that I want to make. Maybe I'll make that point and then I leave it at that. Well, the point is basically that when we think about intergenerational sharing in terms of taking turns, we have to beware not to overstretch the analogy with the swing example. Because the swing is something that is external to the kids that are taking turns with it. They don't have to go on the swing. They could play soccer or whatever, right? They could do something else. They don't need the swing to live. But when you think of, so the swing is not co-constitutive of who they are. So they're taking turns with something that they might also not take turns with. The thing remains external to them. Now that's not the case with Earth, with what I call Earth. I mean by Earth the history and habitat of life. The history and habitat of life. Why history and habitat? Well, history is the temporal notion and habitat is the spatial notion, and I think we need both. And so to fix that disanalogy, not to fix, but to address that disanalogy between the swing and the Earth, I speak of the precedence of Earth's own turn with us. So the Earth is now that which also turns us about, takes turns with us. And it does that on this conception by being co-implicated in the giving birth and the dying. Because there are various sources on which I draw for this, but and that is because the birth is never just birth from a preceding generation. And the living between birth and death is never just a living from other humans. And the dying is never just a dying by passing on into another generation, but it's also always a birthing, a breathing, an eating, and a dying with respect to Earth. That's what the claim here is. And so the thing with which we take turns precedes and exceeds us. It is not a consumable in the sense of the cake either. It is not that which we make, consume, and pass on, but it's what comes before us. We are born into it. It's something into which we are cast, and we cannot but leave it behind to others. Now, of course, we can leave it behind in better or in worse ways, but that's what taking turns is supposed to help us answer. What are the better ways, right? Hence the question, what is it to take a fair turn? But it remains the case that we cannot but leave it behind. Right? And so that's different with a swing or with a bicycle or other kinds of objects that you wouldn't share by cutting them up or by taking them apart. If you share a house, well, also there, you don't share it by, you get the roof and I get the walls, or you don't do that, right? You share it by, well, you get it on Tuesdays and I get it on Wednesdays and so on. That's how you share it. But then the house, well, you can build another one, but you can't build another Earth. That's different. It precedes us and it exceeds us. And that's what needs to be thought here. Now, but then what you have are two turnings, the terrestrial turning and the generational turning. So you have two kinds of turnings that you now have to think. One is, being born of Earth and passing away into Earth, as it were, and always being dependent on it, on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have generations taking turns with that object from which you were born and into which you pass. That's how I try to do it. So this is a little bit more complicated than what you have on the flyer that I think you made it, right? Does anyone have a copy? I promised I would talk a little bit about it, but you know, it's hands passing on a globe from one to the other. And it's interesting that you chose an image where it's black hands passing it on to little small fingers from a child, obviously, but white. Now, you have to hear. These are the generations, and you have to think of the generations as taking turns with the Earth. So when we ask the question, what is it to take a fair turn with future people with the Earth? Then this is the conception of the Earth that we have. But really, the Earth isn't that, because then you could say, oh, they're just, you know, they might as well not share it. It could withhold it, or this generation, it could replace this one with another one, or not replace it, but not share at all. That's not the case. So really, the Earth is this. Right? And so you would want to see these generations coming sort of out of it here. Why did I draw these extra lines, these little lines here, instead of just the big ones? Well, because the Earth turning with us, in a way, disindividuates a generation, because it's the birthing and the dying, those are always singular events. As we said earlier, there isn't a generation that is born in whole cloth all at once and then comes on stage and goes off stage. So that's why actually these lines, they cut through generations, as it were. It's to establish what a generation is always a real social and political effort. It always requires something other than a unity given by nature, as it were. It isn't given by nature. It's always a question of social organization, political organization, and the way we think of ourselves. So really, it's really somewhat problematic, because this makes the Earth like the swing, when it isn't, when it is more like this. But nonetheless, we also have to think of it in this way, I'm suggesting, because we do have to think in terms of what is it to take a fair turns among generations. Okay. Now, to spell this out a little bit more, I have developed this idea of the human being as interred. So I'm trying to, interred means buried, but buried in the earth. So interred, you want to hear terra, earth. So in-earthed. The human being, I argue, is not accidentally placed, as it were, on the earth, and this conception of being on the earth is very important in the history of political philosophy. And Kant, for example, plays a big role. This idea that human beings are on the earth means for Kant that eventually they'll have to conceive of themselves as all belonging to one humanity, right? Because they're distributed on the surface of the earth. So the superficiality of the earth is very important in the history of political philosophy, because it does mean that humanity can come to own the earth as its territory, because it's just placed on it. And in response, I argue, well, it's not quite the way it is. We are placed in the earth, where earth, of course, means sky, climate, and sea, importantly. Right? So it involves non-totalistic conceptions of the earth. So not just the earth as seen as a planet from the outside, which has played such a large role in the thinking of our relationship to the environment over the last 50 years or so. So I developed this conception of us as interred in stressing that our mortal agency implies that we are intrinsically tied to the earth. And that's why I say that the mole and the hedgehog are better models for human beings than the owl or the eagle. And I'm not the first to say this, right? You find this in Nietzsche, you find this in in Derrida and others. That's why I think this, the first image, man-made image from Earth, from outer space, has played a role that can be quite problematic in this respect, because it suggests that we are merely contingently placed on the Earth when really, we could be thinking about, and we should be thinking about, some people are saying, colonizing other planets. So we have a contingent relationship to the Earth, means that we should start thinking about colonizing other planets. Now that's very problematic from a taking turns, intergenerational sharing kind of perspective, because it suggests that, and these arguments are sometimes being made, not yet by serious academic philosophers to the extent I've seen, but in the popular press all the time. The suggestion that it becomes urgent for us to look for other planets because we're wrecking this one. Right? And this notion of the interred condition is meant to be an answer to that. Okay, I leave it at that. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't use up too much time. Thank you.